All right, I think we have pretty much everyone in now. Welcome and thank you all so much for participating today. We're so delighted you could join us for this event co-hosted by OpenSecrets and the World Peace Foundation, capitalizing on conflict, the U.S. arms sales and conflict zones. Today, you'll hear from two experts in the field, Dan Auble and Jennifer Erickson. Dan, our senior researcher at OpenSecrets, will present his findings from OpenSecrets series Capitalizing on Conflicts reports, releasing the first of several case studies focusing on ongoing conflict in Yemen and preview some reports on Syria and Libya as well. And online resource, as well as some online resources for tracking the activities of the defense industry. Jennifer, who is an associate professor of political science and international studies at Boston College, will be sharing her conclusions from a report called On the Front Lines, Conflict Zones and U.S. Arms Exports, in which she investigates export controls and their efficacy on the ground in conflict zones. The reports presented today are part of a joint multi-year project between OpenSecrets and the World Peace Foundation, investigating the effects of the defense industry and influence in policy and conflict, and why the global arms trade has proven remarkably resistant to effective controls. This project is supported in part by funding from the Carnegie Corporation of New York. Jennifer and Dan will both present their findings, and then at the end, we will be answering questions submitted in advance or in our chat room. You can also interact with us by Twitter and follow along with the event using hashtag capitalizing on conflict. And so this will be, the meeting is currently being recorded, as you can tell, and please feel free to submit your questions via the chat. Thank you. And I'm going to pass it off to Dan.
Thank you, Anna. As Anna said, I'm Dan Auble. I'm a senior researcher with OpenSecrets, heading up our investigation of the defense industry and arms sales. About a year ago, OpenSecrets published the first of our Capitalizing on Conflict series. Apologies, I'm having a slideshow issue. Let me just end quickly and start. There we go. So about a year ago, we started our Capitalizing on Conflict series of reports looking at the that report looked at the big picture of money and politics factors that contribute to the power of the defense industry in Washington. Some of the key findings of that report have now been updated and remain important indications of the power of the industry. The major takeaway, though, is that weapons manufacturers spend a lot on influence, but make even more selling arms. As a whole, the defense industry has spent $2.5 billion on lobbying in the last 20 years. 117 million just last year. And our research on the Pentagon employees who went on to be registered defense lobbyists found over 100 in the last few decades and over 500 with employment histories that involve the armed services, foreign relations, and defense appropriations committees in Congress. Now, these numbers sound kind of small when we're throwing around billions and millions figures talking about lobbying and arms sales, but that is a significant amount. These are highly paid, connected people helping companies navigate the policy machinery of Washington using their expertise and connections. While the defense industry spends less than many other industries, they are almost unique in their concentration of power in just a handful of companies that do a large amount of the activity. The top 5 spenders on lobbying account for about half of that 2020 spending that I mentioned. So Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, General Dynamics, and Northrop Grumman make up about 45% of that spending in 2021. And it goes up to about half if you include Boeing, which also has a huge civilian aircraft business, of course, but is one of the largest government contractors. So they get a huge part of their revenue from arming and facilitating the US military itself, but also they haul in nearly all the major weapons sales offered, in particular to Saudi Arabia, that are reviewed and approved by the Pentagon and the State Department. So those are major arms sales. That's according to research from the Center for International Policy from 2019 that examined Raytheon, Lockheed, General Dynamics, and Boeing sales in particular. And of course, it's worth mentioning that money in politics is not the only thing to consider here, as is often the case with various issues. Things like obviously national security and a consistent oil supply, simply having allies in the region are all major drivers of policy as well in this area. But today in particular, we're releasing a report that notes that US manufactured weapons approved for sale by the government are being used in Yemen and resulting in the death of civilians. These arms continue to contribute to the crisis there, where an estimated 100,000 people have died because of both bombing and the results, humanitarian crisis resulting from that, as well as hunger and disease and displacement. There is currently a ceasefire in place that is letting some aid arrive, but it remains to be seen how well that will hold. Of course, past truces have not. In this report, we look at the major players in this conflict, mainly, again, Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, and General Dynamics on the manufacturing side, and Saudi Arabia, and to a lesser extent, the United Arab Emirates as the drivers of the Saudi-led coalition against the Houthi rebels. Saudi Arabia is the biggest consumer of exported US weapons. They have built up their military over the years by buying everything from helicopters to tanks to bombs, Patriot missile systems, and largely by getting them from US manufacturers. And of course, there are services and training contracts as well for that arsenal. From 2015 to 2018, they received $355 million in large arms sales. And in subsequent years, they've been approved to buy $4.5 billion in the future. That includes approvals from the Biden administration for hundreds of millions of dollars, even after campaign promises and an initial pause that he put when he came into office on sales to Saudi Arabia. At the same time that they're buying all these arms, the Saudis and UAE have extensive and expensive operations here in the US to influence politics, policy, and public opinion here. Our analysis of Foreign Agents Registration Act reports, which they have to file when they hire someone in the US to do that influence work. Our analysis of these FARA reports show that the Saudis and UAE have each spent about $130 million since 2016. And both repeatedly mention in those reports that they are funding media outreach campaigns and talking to dozens of members of Congress, specifically on these issues of Yemen and arms sales, and even sometimes mentioning the potential pause or cancellation of sales. Those weapons makers that I mentioned earlier that are whose equipment has been found on the ground related to Yemeni deaths have spent over $50 million on their own lobbying operations in 2021 alone. And again, Raytheon reported working specifically on arms sales pauses as part of their lobbying efforts. Meanwhile, there have been multiple efforts in Congress that have all failed thus far to disapprove or cancel or pause new sales to the countries involved in Yemen because of the human rights and humanitarian crises they're contributing to. But they have all failed thus far. And keep in mind that this is all happening at the same time. So it may not be a coordinated effort, but all these players have somewhat aligned interests or goals that lead to a pretty extensive influence operation, all aiming for some of the same outcomes. So there's kind of a feedback loop here between weapons manufacturers who make billions in profits on arms sales, the countries buying those weapons who are able to arm themselves far more extensively than their domestic production capabilities would be able to supply them, and the US government, who is able to use these sales as tools for economic and diplomatic purposes. But unfortunately, it's ultimately the human beings on the ground in these conflict zones that suffer as a result of the prolonged wars that are fed by these arms from abroad. So in addition to previewing that report, which you'll find on OpenSecrets.org today, I wanted to touch on some of the resources that you can use yourself to dig deeper into both the sale of weapons abroad using data from specialists in that area, but also to look into things like lobbying and campaign contributions and the revolving door on OpenSecrets.org. To start with OpenSecrets, a fine place to begin is on our industry profiles for defense. And here you'll be able to see both historical totals giving total contributions to politicians by cycle, but also get into exactly who in Congress is getting money, which is what you see a snippet of here. And being able to break it down by chamber and the source of the money is also helpful. And you can also look at who is giving the money. And here you'll see several of the companies that I mentioned earlier. In each of these cases, you'll be able to select data that we have going back over 30 years at this point, back to the 1990 election cycle. Also, on OpenSecrets, you can explore their lobbying activities by company, which is what you see here, or by the industry as a whole. and see how much is being spent to push their agenda, what lobbying firms they're hiring, what individual lobbyists they hire, what issues they're working on, including the specific bills that they reported working on, if any. Talking about individual lobbyists, you can see obviously a list here of who they work for and how big the contracts they're listed on are for. But we also have employment history for people who have been through the revolving door and previously worked for the federal government. We share that information. These little circle arrows next to the lobbyist name will take you to their revolving door profile, where you can see the places they've worked and when, and get an idea of whether they worked someplace that's especially relevant to defense operations, for instance, or where they've worked. And the last thing I want to highlight at OpenSecrets is our Foreign Lobby Watch program, which is where we collect the Foreign Agents Registration Act data filed by foreign governments and political parties, in some cases companies. That's one-of-a-kind resource where we've collected all of the reports made available by the Department of Justice going back to the 1940s. Law was originally passed to combat Nazi propaganda, so the reports go back pretty far. We've indexed all those filings so that there's a full text search that you can search for anything mentioned in there. We have also entered the spending information since 2016. So you can compare who's spending the most and who they're hiring. These are generally a resource with a lot of potential for research, as they include so much information that the typical usual lobbying reports under the Lobbying Disclosure Act do not. Details about meetings that they had with members of Congress, the dates and topics of those meetings, outreach they do to media organizations, things like copies of those communications and any advertisements, op-eds, and other public relations materials. So if you're willing to spend some time digging in, there's really a lot of great information here. And of course, you should keep up with our news reporting. I'll plug our newsletter here because we're regularly doing reporting on defense issues in addition to these larger reports. Now, especially for arms sales, we go to some other groups who do great work and have the expertise to collect this data. For kind of a comprehensive international look at international activity, you want to go to the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, or SIPRI. They do extensive research about arms, not just from the US, but all around the world, as you know, the United Kingdom and France and Russia and China are all also major suppliers of arms around the world. So SIPRI's reports and their downloadable data allow, again, comparisons between recipient countries as well as the suppliers. And for a more of a US focused look and a little more detail on that US slice, I'd suggest resources at the center, the Security Assistance Monitor and the Forum on the Arms Trade, where they've collected both the public notifications of planned future sales and actual deliveries for some years. The actual deliveries information is not as readily available. So for some years, Security Assistance Monitor has done a lot of legwork to collect the details of those sales. And speaking of legislation, which is something that the Forum on the Arms Trade, a resource that they provide, is a look at a lot of relevant legislation in this area, as well as fantastic reporting and resources for experts. So I recommend you go there. But speaking of legislation, there's a lot of room for improvement in this area on disclosure and accountability of weapons transfers. There really should be a robust process for making sure that the public and Congress are aware of what's happening, especially given the life and death consequences of this stuff. So OpenSecrets will be continuing to provide our money in politics data and mine it for unique research like this, including future similar reports that look at other conflict areas like Syria and Libya. But we also hope to help move the needle on getting toward a more timely and complete disclosure regime, covering a wider range of equipment and types of arms and services in the future. So I urge you to check out OpenSecrets.org, as well as World Peace Foundation's resources, which Jennifer may point to, and look for our report on Yemen coming out today. And with that, I'll send it back to Anna.
Thank you, Dan. Next up, we will have Jennifer Erickson sharing some of the conclusions from her report on the front lines, conflict zones, and U.S. arms exports. And I will pass it off to you, Jennifer.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen just a minute.
And while you were sharing your screen, I just want to remind everyone that if you do have any questions for the Q&A, please just message me directly and I will make sure that they get included at the end, or you can tweet us at capitalizing on conflict. Thank you.
So hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Thanks to OpenSecrets for organizing this great event and sharing their great research, and to Carnegie for funding the opportunity for us to do this project and work on it together. This has been a really fantastic experience. Today I'm going to present some of my report, a portion of my report that came out last month with World Peace Foundation, on looking at U.S. arms exports in conflict zones. I just want to start by giving you kind of a quick overview about what we've been working on at World Peace Foundation for this grant. Our sort of focus has been looking at why, despite all these robust domestic regulations, international export criteria, and monitoring efforts, has the global arms trade proven so remarkably resistant to effective controls, with really big consequences for civilians on the ground in those conflict zones. And at WPF, we have 4 reports that are now out. I'll share the link to the WPF website at the end of my talk. But we have a quantitative overview report by Sam Perlow-Freeman that came out last year that looks at broad trends in arms exports to conflict zones over time. We also have 3 case studies on major conventional arms exporters and their practices, one on France, one on the UK, and one on the US. That came out in the past several weeks. Those are all up on the World Peace Foundation website, and we'll be sharing that link with you later. My report on the front lines contains case studies, not just of the Saudi case in the Yemen war that I'll be talking about today, but also looking at South Sudan, Nigeria, and non-state actor transfers in Libya and Syria. Today I'm going to focus on U.S. arms exports to Saudi and UAE because they are direct participants in the Yemen war, and I especially want to focus on the role of Congress as a supposed check on executive deal making here. So the core question this talk will focus on today is sort of set up by this scenario. US arms sales to Saudi Arabia and UAE have presented, I think, a best case scenario in recent years for mobilizing congressional opposition, particularly in 2019. And yet, even in that best case scenario, Congress still failed to block the deals. So my question for us today is, why did Congress fail, and what lessons can we learn for US law and policy? And just to preview, my core findings suggests that recipient conflict is not a consistent deterrent for US arms transfers. Although it comes up as a consideration in US arms export law and policy, it doesn't really actually serve as much a deterrent. As Sam Perlow-Freeman's quantitative report shows, the US is pretty consistently exporting to most conflicts worldwide. And I think that the new Cold War dynamics that we see today will likely further discourage export restraints. So this isn't going to get easier, it's only going to get harder. This is in part because US export law provides presidential administrations with significant flexibility in applying the rules of the road to arms deal making, which means that although the US arms export law is often referred to as sort of the gold standard of arms export laws around the world, there's still a lot of flexibility for presidential policy and preferences to sort of rule what's going to happen in practice. And this brings us to Congress. Congress is meant to serve as a check on the president and the executive branch, but in practice is structurally incapable of serving as that check on US government sales. And this has a lot of consequences for arms exports to conflict zones. One, because these can prolong conflict and humanitarian violations, but also when we just come to talking about US direct sort of interests, recipients of US arms might not always follow US interests and US preferences. And we can see this in the Saudi case especially. In other kinds of arms sales, particularly to non-state actors, we also see sort of a persistent problem of US arms falling into the wrong hands, that is, being diverted into terrorist hands potentially. So as much as the US thinks that its arms might buy influence with other governments, those recipients might not actually follow US interests, and they might actually undermine them in the process. So with this in mind, the report argues that US export rules should be reformed to include requirements for substantive risk analyses. This both considers risk of conflict onset or the sort of prolonging of conflict, as well as risk of diversion to actors the US doesn't want to get its arms. And second, it suggests that US arms export rules should require an explicit presumption of denial in cases of recipient engagement in genocide, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. And the reason this report particularly focuses on reforming law and policy and not just sort of the accountability mechanisms behind it is that it's not clear that anybody is really disobeying US arms export rules at all, and that the rules themselves might need some reform. In addition, the sort of checks in the system, particularly the congressional check in the system, we face these sort of lobbying issues that Dan raises in his research that are deeply embedded in the congressional system and in domestic politics in general. So even should we sort of give Congress more ability to kind of enforce the rules, it's not clear that the rules have much concrete to enforce in some ways, or that Congress would be all that interested in enforcing the rules. In addition, making these clearer rules in export law would facilitate a role for the judiciary as an additional check on US arms export execution. So I want to give you a little bit of background on Congress and US arms exports and what US arms export law and policy actually kind of says. And although this is a slide about Congress, I'm going to start with the president because Congress is really a sort of a side player in this game. So presidential authority in this realm reigns supreme. This is embodied in the US Arms Export Control Act that goes back to 1976, set sort of in the aftermath of the Vietnam War, which gives presidential authority over arms exports and imports. And with that, provides an obligation for the executive branch to consider the risk of conflict, but doesn't actually involve a straight up obligation to deny a license if conflict is at risk. So there's flexibility built into this. Nothing in US export law says you have to deny it in the risk of a conflict. And this means that presidential preferences can be pretty can do what they like in many ways with arms exports. There are a few international regulations, but very little that's arms export specific. The US does need to follow international law in making its arms export decisions, but there's not a lot of restraint in the international realm. So Congress's role is limited. Under the Arms Export Control Act, it's really intended as a check on executive decision-making. And in this way, the president is required to notify Congress 30 calendar days in advance of any sale over $14 million. And unless Congress passes legislation that blocks or otherwise modifies the proposed sales, the sales may proceed. This means that in practice, Congress must have veto-proof legislation to modify or block sales, because although it might pass legislation, if it goes to the president, we assume that the president wants to make the sale, so this president will not sign the legislation. It will go back to Congress, and therefore it will need that 2/3 majority to override the veto. And that in practice has never successfully happened. We've seen twice Congress actually pass legislation, but never have veto-proof majority to do that. So the voting thresholds to pass legislation to make this sort of Congress's role as a for accountability sort of more meaningful, or to provide that arms transfer oversight, we just haven't seen it happen. And so this suggests some sort of structural problems with the system. So the bottom line for me here is that, one, Congress's role is structurally limited. There's only so much Congress can do because it needs that veto-proof majority. Second, Congress's members in general are less inclined to vote to support restraint. So even when they can do it, they haven't really done it, and not enough, not even 2/3 majority have been willing to vote in favor of this. And I think we can see this for a number of reasons. The data that Dan shows us on lobbying and sort of the story about defense industry lobbying can be part of the story. I also think that the general perception of the US public is that it's either inattentive to this issue, or it might even support individual sales, particularly if those sales keep US boots off the ground in a conflict zone. So there's little political gain for many members of Congress to have in showing restraint on this issue. And in fact, those Congress members in some cases might actually sort of see support for the arms sales rather than seek restraint. This suggests that the system itself is not really built to impose restraint. And so we can see this happen in US arms transfers to Saudi Arabia and UAE, which are key participants in the Yemen conflict. This is one case in my report that looks at US arms transfers to governments engaged in conflict. And here with this case, as Dan mentioned, US arms transfers to Saudi Arabia are a very long-standing and accepted feature of US foreign policy. And before 2015, they were seen as a largely, for many, not everybody, but many, a positive thing, that there was a perception of economic benefits associated with them. And it was seen to be sort of low risk for use in conflict, that US could sell these, they wouldn't be used in war, they were mainly meant to deter, for example, Iran. Although there are questions about whether those economic benefits actually materialize, this was sort of the perception in US foreign policy. And between 1990 and 2020, Saudi Arabia was the largest importer of US major conventional weapons, and indeed in the whole world, the second largest importer from anybody. And neighboring UAE was in the top 10. Even revelations, I would note, after September 11th, that many of the hijackers came from Saudi Arabia. This didn't sort of dent this arms sales relationship. It's only really been since 2015, both with Saudi Arabia's Yemen intervention and the Khashoggi murder in 2018, that we've seen public controversy introduced to US arms sales to Saudi Arabia. And we see, first of all, arms that the US sold to Saudi Arabia before 2015 used in conflict. So those arms that were sold with the assumption that they wouldn't be used in conflict are now actively being used in conflict. And even with the onset of conflict, we see the US overall continue to replenish supplies, fulfill existing orders, and make new orders with Saudi Arabia. So we don't see conflict as a deterrent here. This suggests one persistent challenge I want to highlight with US arms transfers, that is that Saudi or UAE interests do not often align with US preferences when it comes to arms exports. So simply selling arms does not necessarily buy the US government influence with those other governments. But I still think this was the best case scenario for congressional action. In most cases, we don't get public attention, we don't get media attention. There isn't sort of the call for congressional scrutiny that there was here. So after 2015, and particularly after 2018, we see a lot more mobilization of the public, a lot more interest of the public, a lot more scrutiny from Congress over time. And yet even here, where we have all these kind of factors line up in favor of congressional action, we still see in 2019 Congress passing legislation to block sales, but doing so without that veto-proof majority, and so it fails. Most recently in 2021, Congress overwhelmingly rejected a bipartisan bill to block. So we see the majority of senators, the vast majority of Congress people voting against legislation to block sales. And so it is very hard to get Congress to take this kind of action. And over time, this isn't just a sort of issue of the current Congress and sort of the political partisanship that we see in the current Congress. This crosses party lines in many cases and has been the case for many decades. We do see some indirect effects of this attention. We see some case-specific rejections by the Obama and Biden administrations, particularly thinking about which kinds of weapons might be used in the war versus not. We see a sort of review of the policy overall by the Biden administration upon entering office. But this isn't sort of a broad overhaul of US arms exports in this case. It's a much more sort of case-by-case set of scrutiny. So the bottom line here is first that the US is unlikely to block arms sales to existing government customers. Those are in place often for a very long time, and whether there's conflict or not, the US continues to sell. And congressional efforts to block those sales are extremely rare and really structurally incapable of success. What you need to have lined up to make them happen just isn't going to happen. And so this is what the Saudi case, I think, especially shows us, that even in cases of heightened media attention, public concern, and congressional action, few changes are actually in practice made to US arms exports in response to conflict. So even when all these factors line up, things still pretty much proceed business as usual. So a few of the overall findings of the report that I want to highlight for you today is first this big picture comment that conflict is not a consistent deterrent for US arms exports, despite conflict being an issue that US arms export law and presidential policy often calls on the executive branch to consider in the process of making export deals. Second, US presidential administrations face few real restrictions in their ability to use arms exports to meet their policy goals. They can largely follow their preferences, and Congress isn't going to serve as an effective check on the executive branch in this case. Third, not something we've talked so much about here today, but one I think is worth continuing to highlight, which is that arms transfers come with intractable risks. The US can't guarantee that the weapons it transfers potentially to Saudi Arabia before 2015 for defensive purposes will be continued to use that way and will be used by recipients in the ways that it intends or in ways that serve US interests. Fourth, these emerging Cold War dynamics that we see today, the return of great power competition, I think will increase US reluctance to cut off arms supplies to conflict zones and make it very much harder to reform legislation or to reform processes of arms export deals. So one final point is that giving Congress a greater role just in and of itself might not be sufficient to change US behavior. Congress might be reluctant to take on that sort of more restrictive role, and that we might also need to reform US law and policy itself in order to see some changes in US behavior. So with that, I want to put up some information for you on the screen. You can see all of the project reports as well as our really excellent website, Who Arms War, with access to all sorts of data on arms exporters, exports to conflict zones at the World Peace Foundation website at Tufts University. So if that's too much of a link for you there, I'd encourage you just to Google Tufts World Peace Foundation and you'll find all of this information. So thank you so much again, and we look forward to your questions.
Thank you both. I'm going to move along to the Q&A, but if anyone has additional questions as we start asking, please feel free to keep messaging or sending those along on Twitter. So just to kick us off, let's see what we have. So the first question would be, what ways other than campaign money are what ways and other than campaign money are politicians tied to these companies in the defense sector? And I think this is probably more for Dan.
Yeah, I can take that one. Beyond the revolving door issues I mentioned earlier, which are kind of wrapped up in lobbying as well, those issues mean that former employees and friends are able to get meetings with their recent coworkers and have their calls taken in ways that maybe the average citizen can't. There are also, I didn't touch on campaign contributions really all that much, but we did and have found that members of the relevant committees, the armed services committees and committees that oversee the defense budget have gotten a greater percentage of the defense industry's contributions over time. So that's an interesting fact. Yeah, another thing that some research came out recently done by Business Insider about the investments of those committee members in owning stocks of these defense companies. And I think they found over a dozen, maybe 15 of the members of the armed services committees have personal investments in military contractors. And the personal finances are something you can also check out on OpenSecrets.org. We collect those reports as well. There's also the fact that defense manufacturers have factories and office buildings and facilities in many congressional districts all over the country, which is sometimes cited as a point of leverage for them with members of Congress. It's often like the manufacturers overstate maybe the economic impact of their activities often, but the perception is still there, especially among the politicians themselves, that it's a jobs issue, which of course, jobs is a sensitive word for a politician.
I'm not sure if you had anything you wanted to add on that one, Jennifer, but we do have a couple others. So even if new rules are passed addressing arms sales, what kinds of checks would need to be put in place to help ensure that Congress actually enforces those rules? I'm not sure if either of you would want to take that one. You, Jennifer?
I can give it a start. I think a lot of this comes down to congressional incentives and sort of the lack of incentives for Congress to enforce the rules. And so a lot of this is not just sort of what is the structure of Congress and how is it set up and how does it vote on things, but whether there are members of Congress who want to pay attention to this, who think that there are benefits for their own constituencies or for their own careers to make paying attention to and providing that sort of additional scrutiny to US arms sales to be a part of what they do. And so with that, I think a lot of this can relate to sort of the lack of interest from the US public. And so I think efforts like this to sort of get out research, educate people, youth campaigns that World Peace Foundation has been sort of working on. I think these can be useful too, raising sort of public awareness about what's going on, what the consequences are, challenging some of these perceptions that the economic benefits are for everybody, that these are really about what's good for the country as a whole, as opposed to what's good for individual industries or individual politicians. So I think, I actually think that it goes beyond just reforming the rules, and really feeds into when does Congress have an incentive to enforce those rules. I also think could be some interesting dynamics if you reform the rules to having the judiciary more involved, and particularly when NGOs feel like they can submit lawsuits when the rules aren't being followed. So taking it out of Congress's hands entirely and sort of spreading out the responsibility for enforcing the rules and making it possible to involve perhaps the judiciary a little bit more. So we've seen this a little bit start in the US in the past couple of years. It's been a trend more common in other countries, but I think that could be part of the story too.
Great, thank you. We have a few other questions that have come in through direct message as well as just on the chat. One is, do you have any resources, or sorry, I'm curious if it has been possible to track any of these arms sales back to the streets in the USA? And then somewhat relatedly, any comment on the transfer of military equipment to city police? Not sure if there's enough relevant with this since it's mostly just tracking US.
So what I would say is there's a big difference between tracking major conventional arms systems, which is largely where we're focusing here and where a lot of the big money is, the big money in politics. And it's quite a different story when it comes to small arms and light weapons. The tracing there is often to what we see, for example, a high number of sort of straw purchases in the US that are then trafficked across the border to Mexico and into Latin America that fund criminal gangs, drug trafficking organizations, and so on. And there are a lot of problems with that. And so the sort of back to the streets, what are US domestic rules kind of doing for that, I think does affect the illicit small arms trade. That's not so much the kind of focus of what we're looking at here, but it certainly does do that, and I think that can be destabilizing as well. And so it's a good question. It is relevant. It's less about the money that goes into sort of the lobbying system, though, and a lot more about illicit sales.
Thank you. One other question, do you have any resources you would recommend to explore the situation in Ukraine, particularly sales to Ukraine prior to the Russia invasion?
My thinking is that the Forum on the Arms Trade, which Dan brought up as one of his resources in his talk, would be a great place to look. I think Forum, I'm a member of Forum on the Arms Trade, but I'm not in charge of its website. But I think Jeff Abramson and others have put together a lot of great resources on that. I've also seen some other things go around, and I'm really sorry, I don't remember the websites. There's been a lot that's sort of been flooding email lately, but I think I'd start with Forum on the Arms Trade and check out what's been going on there, on Ukraine especially.
Great. So one other question is, defense companies and foreign governments influence limited to federal campaigns, or is it something that seeps into state politics as well? And how do those campaign contributions and lobbying shape the way that politicians legislate while they're in office? That might be for you, Dan.
Yeah. So, I mean, OpenSecrets has recently added resources for state contributions and to some extent lobbying, and that is something that we are building out. In the looks we've taken at state lobbying, these companies are not as involved, and of course the issues are going to be different there at the two different levels. Where in states they may be looking at things like tax incentives and more traditional business and employee type issues than we see at the federal level, but there has been some activity there, and we're hoping to do some investigation of that now that we have expanded our resources. Anna, you're muted.
Sorry about that. I got stuck on mute. I apologize. So this question is probably a bit more for Jennifer, but what structural changes would you propose to reassert Congress's role in approving or disapproving arms sales?
This is a really interesting question. I think there's a lot of proposals out there to suggest that Congress gets more advance notice, for example, more than 30 days. Often that's done sort of informally, but to make that more formal. You could also consider lowering the sort of dollar figure that it would take to get Congress actually to be notified about a deal potentially. I think there are other potential things. I think you could say that if the arms export is going to a conflict zone, then perhaps Congress should have a look at it. I think there are ways that you could kind of build that into the legislation, or sort of alter the legislation to sort of lower the bar for congressional involvement. There are some that suggest it should also be able to get out of committee more easily and bring straight to the floor. I'm not a Congress expert, so I don't want to comment more specifically on how that would actually work. But there are certainly proposals that are going on that look at those different aspects of making Congress more involved, or at least making it more structurally capable of doing something. I think that still leaves the question of whether Congress people want to do something, but you can certainly make it easier for them to do something. And that would be some, lots of great groups in Washington thinking about how to do that, and I encourage you to learn more. I think there's some really great legislative resources on the Forum for the Arms Trade website as well.
Great, thank you. And one final question before we move on. Is there a cross-reference as to what other companies specific lobbyists are lobbying for? So when they're lobbying for multiple interests, is there a way to look into that? And this would be more for Dan.
Yes, definitely. In the lobbying resources that I pointed to on our website, which is basically a lobbying section that you can access from the menus on the homepage, everything is linked. You can look at a lobbyist profile, so look at an individual lobbyist, see everyone that they have worked for over the years, at least as a registered lobbyist, as well as those links to the revolving door that I mentioned. There is also some information about individuals in the Foreign Lobby Watch, FARA information. And in the lobbyist profiles, we also detail contributions that they've made. So you can see, in addition to who a lobbyist works for, what politicians they're giving to.
Thank you. Do either of you have final thoughts that you would like to share, starting with Jennifer? Any other points that we haven't made yet, or things that you wanted to be asked but were not?
I think this is a really huge issue, and I'm really just glad to see a great group of people here. I encourage you to reach out if you have questions. I'm happy to be a resource and a contact for you, and so I will just leave it at that. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much for joining us today, and thank you to everyone for participating. I know that we are about to come to a close, and I don't want to keep anyone over, but thank you all for your great questions, and thank you to the Carnegie Corporation of New York for its support that has made this ongoing work possible. Please feel free to reach out to any of us with any additional questions, and please, anyone who's curious to read, the reports are available at the links that were shared in the chat and on the websites. So thank you all so much, and have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.